Today's topic is hiring for success. Now, the thing about hiring and recruiting and selection, it's a target-rich topic. Now, many of you on this call, you're on this call because you want to learn more about how to become more efficient or how to improve that time to fill metric, which is obviously important to all of us. But as I said, it's a target-rich topic. Many of you are deeply embedded in your own recruiting and selection process that you could probably easily lead your own webinar or presentation on your process and best practices. And I like to think webinars are an opportunity to think different about things, meaning that I'm not going to go through step by step of each step within the process, but instead I'm going to try to get us to think different about focusing on a different metric. And I know that time to fill metric is important, but I want us to think about speed over velocity. And when I refer to velocity, I'm talking about, are we filling positions in the least amount of time, as quickly as possible? But sometimes that doesn't always guarantee fit. Now, when we're using AcuMax Index in the recruiting and selection process, what we recommend is as early as possible. Now, we do work with a few users that will push the AcuMax Index a little later in the process. And just being direct, we disagree with that. We feel that that is a way of taking away some of the objectivity earlier in the process and putting it on a back end and then relying on our ability to interview or the types of questions that we're asking or their resume and their experience. And that's how we're qualifying that particular candidate through the rest of the filtering process. Now, again, we don't necessarily agree with that because a lot of it's going to be relied on your ability to read that person during the interview, again, based on those questions that you're asking. Now, there's an interesting study or a bulletin that was released by the FBI in the early 2000s. I want to say it was around 2008 to 2010. It was a bulletin that was released by the FBI to encourage their agents to stop relying on body language because there was no conclusive evidence that would determine whether or not somebody was being deceitful. A suspect or an alleged suspect was being deceitful. And we hear it all the times, or maybe we see those movies, or maybe just because it is kind of cool to read body language and to say when that person's arms cross, maybe that means they're defensive or they're not telling the truth. So the more common one that the bulletin was based on is when the eyes are shifting and looking to the upper left, that's going to this creative side of the brain and they're trying to come up with a story. But 23 out of 24 peer studies that the FBI referred to in this bulletin, 23 out of 24 peer studies indicate that there was no conclusive evidence that you should be able to jump to that conclusion that that person is being deceitful based on where their eyes are shifting or how their arms are crossed. And we do put a lot of reliance in our ability to read body language based on what we know about that person's resume and how they're answering our questions. And in fact, there's something that I term as delayed and consequential duality. When we're interviewing somebody without any type of third-party objectivity, like a pre-hire assessment, we're more exposed to the social sides of that profile. The social sides meaning they're going to be at their most agreeable, the most hospitable. They're going to be charismatic, and they're going to lead us to believe and lure us into this idea that they're a very social individual. But because we're so focused on that social, there's a lot of delayed consequence to that. What's more observable during that interview is the social side of the profile. And it's not necessarily that they're lying, it's more of an embellishment or an exaggeration, meaning that somebody that's coming across as very agreeable is also less confrontational. And we like that person, especially if we're thinking about filling a sales role, or we're thinking about filling a customer success role, or a role that is taking in customer concerns and challenges, somebody that's client facing. We're being more exposed to the social side of who they are during that interview, not realizing that 3 to 6 months into the job, there's a delayed consequence. Meaning the social that we're getting so much of during the interview will prevent them from executing on some of the more important tasks that will trigger the possibility for more confrontation, such as negotiation or saying no or being pushed back on. When we're agreeable, we're less likely to engage in conflict or difficult conversations. But we don't suffer from that or realize that until 3 to 6 months into the job. And that's the point of this duality and that delayed consequence. We like that person during the interview. We're not relying on third-party objectivity. We've put the AcuMax Index a little further into the process than maybe we should have. So then we're purely relying on what we know and what we feel. And sure, maybe we've been doing it for years. And we have somewhat of a sharp gauge or radar on how somebody is commenting or smiling. But know that when that person's interviewing, they're really putting on the social. Sometimes that can lead to consequences in the back end, such as delaying or forgetting difficult job duties. So, but more importantly than that, more importantly than any of that, certainly we want you to utilize AcuMax Index as early in the process as possible, because that's going to serve as third-party objectivity to help you examine some of these candidates in a manner that's not so reliant on unconscious bias. But more importantly in that, what I want us to think about today is really the central theme of this entire webinar is, what do you currently know about your top performers? What do you currently know about those that are already a fit in their position? This is what I always find interesting about organizations, especially organizations that are really in that growth phase, right? Where they're trying to think, how can we be smarter with process? And when we think process, especially in product or project management, for example, the definition of scale makes sense. Growing and expanding your business operations to handle more work without losing quality or efficiency. Now, absolutely, that makes sense when it comes to project management. We're being as efficient, we're utilizing our resources, we're getting our resources more focused, we're able to do more with less people. But when we think of human resources and when we think of recruiting and selection, efficiency and speed just means filling positions as fast as possible. Now, sure, we could argue that the faster our time to fill is, that fit should be there as well. But there is no study that references a strong, significant correlation between time to fill and fit. And speed doesn't necessarily guarantee the one question that we're always asking ourselves. And if you're not asking yourself, I know that a hiring manager or your CEO or somebody in a C-suite is asking the question, how do we duplicate Susie? How do we duplicate Tommy? How do we duplicate Pedro? Because these are the folks that are in the position that are doing well. And that's what I want us to start thinking about for the remainder of this webinar. It is not necessarily how are we creating the most efficient process in recruiting and selection to increase that time to fill metric, but how are we scaling performance? Because that answers the question in regards to how do we duplicate fill in the blank. And scaling performance starts with interviewing your top performers, then converting that into an ideal performance template, or also known as a position profile. But not position profile as you know it. We're going to think a lot different about that today as well. It's a position profile that, rather than having people select a bunch of words that determine when a task is more important and done frequently, this is going to give you an opportunity to qualify that position profile based on how your current performers, your top performers, above average performers are doing in that, are performing in that job today. And I would encourage you to use things like your performance review metrics to determine who are our top performers. Who's hitting their goals and their objectives week in and week out. What this does require at first is it requires us to think about any one of our jobs and then breaking that job down into tasks. Because what we're going to do is we're going to take those tasks, we're going to convert those tasks into questions. And those questions we're going to ask our current top performers in that position. That will later turn into behavioral-based interviewing questions that you can ask your candidates. Because again, we're focused more on scaling performance than we are in creating the most efficient, fast process. Now, ultimately, you're going to have a more efficient process because of this, but it's going to be based on what you're doing with your top performers first. So if we take customer success representative, CSR, you may refer to it as maybe customer service. But a lot of organizations, this customer success role is broken down into a few different categories. Now, for those of you who are on this call and you have customer success roles, you may have additional categories, and that's fine. It's just for the sake of timing. But you can see here, customer success involves a few different categories of onboarding and implementation, issue resolution and support coordination, and of course, that discussion about renewals and retention. Now, taking any one of these, or ideally all of these categories, and breaking each of them into their separate tasks, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to focus on number 4, issue resolution and support coordination. And if we were to break that into tasks, here are a few examples of what the task of that actual job looks like. Product knowledge, learning about the product as much as we can. Logging and prioritizing customer issues. How are we triaging that? When a customer calls, how are we prioritizing that? Following up with internal teams, well, why do we need to do that? Well, because sometimes we need to go talk to support and gather intelligence or data in regards to the past history support tickets when it comes to contacting that client. Maybe that customer has been upset and they've issued a bunch of tickets in the past that we haven't resolved. So I want to know that. So I need to lean on the support team or the technical team or the app dev team in order to learn more about what this customer is going to be asking about. Or maybe it's an opportunity to learn about enhancements in the future, and I can use that as an opportunity to upsell. But it's keeping those customers informed and well and documenting those recurring issues. Now, after I've broken these categories into specific jobs into tasks, then I want to turn that into questions. And again, some continuity here. I'm still staying with the CSR position as it relates to issue resolution and support coordination. Now, if I were to convert these particular tasks into questions, these are what the questions are going to look like. Now, to clarify, these are not necessarily the questions that I'm going to ask new hires or applicants through our recruiting and selection process. These are questions that I'm going to ask those who are currently in the CSR role today, who are performing above average. You may, or top performers, or however you refer to those particular individuals. So I may ask questions. What are you doing to learn about our products? How are you prioritizing customer issues? How are you interacting with internal teams today? And what are you doing to keep customers informed? Now, here's an example of what that might sound like. So what are you doing to learn about our products today? In that answer from that current CSR could be, I'm constantly reaching out to see what's new, what's being enhanced. I want to know about maintenance schedules, because if there's some downtime, I want to try to reach out to customers and let them know that, hey, you know, at 2 a.m., we're going to be down for maintenance. For the first 3 months, I demoed our core solutions and constantly asked questions to our app dev team, right? So that's probably an answer or similar answer to what you might get to somebody who's performing in that role or excelling in that role today. Now, if you're using AcuMax Index, for those of it you are during the recruiting and selection process, you have an extra bonus here, right? Because now this is going to help you qualify that their answer. So we know from a low A and high B perspective, low A inclusion, I'm constantly reaching out and interacting with other functions in the organization. Low A's will do that because they know that's what helps their decision making. If I'm getting along with others and I'm feeling part of a team, and I'm doing that in a more proactive manner and learning about, again, maintenance schedules, support tickets, what are new enhancements or new versions of our solutions in the next 5 years. That's very much a low A quality. From a high B perspective, it's experiencing, right? It's being open to these new experiences rather than being taught in a didactic way about our solutions. I want to experience the solution. So having the AcuMax Index is going to help us qualify some of these answers, and it also helps us buy into that third-party objectivity a little bit more. And it gives us a visual for our hiring managers, not only the visual of the AcuMax, but a specific question as it reflects a current top performer. Another question could be, what are you doing to keep customers informed? Again, here, if you're using AcuMax Index, once I review and prioritize the ticket, I immediately send a meeting invite no more than 24 hours from when the ticket was issued. This keeps me on task. And if I know a client is curious about a resolution, it's also an opportunity for an upsell. So here we're talking about high B, that sense of urgency, moving quickly, being very responsive, but also high D from a structured point of view. I'm keeping myself on task. I'm keeping myself organized. And then lastly, I also keep track of all their tickets, and so I'm aware of their experiences with our products. So high D profiles tend to be a little more data-driven. The more data-driven they are, the more confident they are on a discussion with a customer who's upset or happy. We talking intelligently about that product. Now, you could do this with certainly more than one person who's excelling in that position. But ultimately, what we would like for you to think about is how do you take all of these answers from internal team members who are excelling in the position, and then converting that into the position profile. So again, this is what a position profile for a customer success rep looks like. Now we know that customer success rep is accommodating and inclusive. From a high B perspective, they're more expressive. They're really good at telling stories and empathizing with concerns. They have a very expressive communication style. They can deal with regular day in, day out interruptions, a lot of multitasking and sense of urgency. And then, of course, from the high D perspective, structured and data driven. Now, again, this position profile is going to be created based on the internal interviews you're doing with your top performers. And the entire purpose of this is to have something to contextualize every other step of the process. So when you are looking at their resume, you're thinking about the interviews that you've already done internally. When you're looking at their AcuMax, you're comparing it with the position profile. Then you're doing the phone screens, and then certainly the skills and experience interview, and then the culture fit. Now you have specific questions that are contextualized based on all the work you've done previous to this. And that it's more likely for you to duplicate the performance of your top performers doing it in this manner instead of just relying on that time to fill metric. So then how do you use this when it comes to finding that right candidate and selecting that person for that particular CSR role, as an example? Now, for those of you who are using AcuMax Index, we have within the software, you can take any AcuMax Index profile and compare it to a position profile. But again, this brings a little more meaning and a little more impact to this entire process, because of the entire point of this webinar is to think about the context that we're defining ahead of time. So now when we're looking at Maurice Clooney, who's 100% matched to that CSR role, and you can see the different color codes that we have on the left side of the screen, 75 graders considered as a good match. But as we've talked to other users, there's been times where we've heard from other users that, hey, Maurice is 100%, but they weren't really answering the questions during the interview the way we were expecting, or maybe how we would want them to answer. But now what you're doing is you're creating these questions based on what you're hearing internally from your top performers, so they're a little more focused on the actual job role, but also within the context of that position profile. So this is where we go into how can you craft those behavioral-based interview and questions. The behavioral-based interview and questions is using this as an example. When we think of CSR, product knowledge is extremely important. I think everybody would agree with that. What do we want to learn when it comes to converting this or asking this question to a candidate? Does a candidate take time to learn about product solutions and user experience? How are they leveraging this product knowledge during customer support? So an example of an interview question based on what you know and everything you've done previous to this is, tell me about a time when your product knowledge was a primary determining factor for finding a resolution that your customer was happy with. So what does that look like in action? Again, just a very simple example here, still within the context of CSR. Tell me about a time when your product knowledge was the primary determining factor for resolution that your customer was happy with. So here, you're already equipped with the profile of your top CSRs, but also the position profile. You're also equipped with a lot of intelligence in how you're qualifying that position profile based on their answers. This is just an answer from one person. Imagine if you had 15 answers from 5 different people in that role, right? That would be pretty convincing, I would think. And then when you're asking that same question to Maurice may answer the question in a way of, when the customer was talking about the problem, I knew exactly what she was struggling with because I took it upon myself to use their software before I was hired in my previous role. So before I was hired in my previous role, for 3 months, I actually bought their solution. I used it, and I was running into the same exact problem that this user was. So it just seemed second nature to me, and I had that conversation. That's very similar to what we heard from our internal top performers. Not only similar in regards to response, but also similar in regards to profile. So again, it's that process of qualification as well. As we're asking these questions, that's going to help not only convince me as part of the recruiting and selection team, but also the hiring managers, who at times have the tendency of want to administering their own assessments that slows everything down. And a lot of that comes down to maybe they're not as educated in AcuMax, or maybe they don't feel that just that profile is going to be holistically representative of who we're looking for. But now we have a lot more data behind it because we know those answers that are coming from our top performers to help qualify that position profile. And it also helps us evaluate in a manner where we can focus more on alignment with our top performers. So you can continue to use the STAR method. We recommend using the STAR method. The keys on the left side of the screen, we want to think about situation, context, is it relevant and clear, clarified role or objective, action, are they describing specific steps like your top performers, result measurable against top performers or meaningful outcomes. Now there's a scoring scheme as well. When you think of a number one, right, struggle to provide a clear example or one that indicates a difference from your top performers. But if you look at number four, we want to emphasize alignment, right? We're emphasizing a little more on alignment. They're compelling, high impact example that also happens to be very similar with that top performer. And by the way, their AcuMax Index happens to be similar to the position profile of CSR as well. In closing, three final thoughts. Number one is context. What are you using to contextualize your process? Not only to keep you focused, but also to keep your hiring managers focused as well. Because we're not thinking, again, about having a process that's going to get us time to fill as fast as possible. It's important, yes, but here we're also thinking about fit. Because what good is time to fill if the fit isn't there, right? It's fast to fill, but a lot of wasted time and money on the wrong fit. So we really want to focus on having that context and what we're thinking about, what we're referencing. Scaling performance, that's going to help us duplicate top performers. And then, of course, score alignment. Scoring more on alignment based on what you know and the work that you've done more than purely just a standard list of questions or interview questions or looking at resumes and so on. Now you can customize your behavioral-based interviewing questions based on what you know about your top performers. We are really excited to have this level of participation on our webinars, and we certainly hope to see you again in the future when we have more. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.